If you're comparing a full frame sensor to an APS-C sensor or crop sensor, I can almost guarantee that you're doing it wrong. Before we get started, quick reminder, be sure and check out my podcast, which is available anywhere that podcasts can be found. Join my group on Facebook, Pro Photo Talk with Boo-Ray Perry, because it's a great community. And all the links to all my gear are listed in the description right down there. Go check out all the stuff that I carry and why, all my accessories, etc. And if you use one of those links, I get a couple of dollars, and it helps me to keep this channel alive. All right, so we're going to talk about APS-C versus full frame. We're going to talk about crop versus full frame today, and we've talked about this a lot on the channel. But what happened was I had someone write a great comment to one of my other videos talking about their decision to go with full frame over crop sensor. And I started writing a reply, and the reply got to be about this long. And I said, you know what, this should be a video. This should be a video. So here's the video. Here's my reply to that person and the video that I'm making from it, because I think that people, when they start to look at comparing the full frame and the crop sensor cameras, that they look at it wrong. They come from a place of what's the best, right? What's the best? What performs the best? And in almost every metric, well, then it's going to be full frame. Full frame is the best. Full frame is better, right? And I think you're looking at it wrong. So if you're looking at these two sensors trying to decide for yourself, let me give you another way of looking at it. I'm going to talk about a few things that are kind of a myth, and a few statements that can kind of be turned on their heads. All right? So let's get started with the first thing I want to talk about, which is this. Probably the number one issue that gets brought up again and again and again when you're talking about full frame versus APS-C versus crop is the depth of field issue. And the full frame people, and listen, I was a full frame person. I shot full frame for about 12 years and then just recently moved to a crop sensor. And it's easy to say that, well, I'm just defending crop sensors. But no, the truth is I looked at both sides. I really did. And this is a big, big issue, a huge issue. So yes, let's get it right out there. If you are shooting with a full frame sensor at 4.0, and I am shooting with a crop sensor at 4.0, you will have a more shallow depth of field. More bokeh, more background blur, right? Nicer, better. Sure, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. However, the other way you can look at it is this. If you are shooting at 4.0 and I am shooting at 4.0, I will have more in focus than you do. And no one ever talks about that. Everyone always acts like the more shallow depth of field is always better in every situation. And it's not. It absolutely is not. Many times, shallow depth of field is your enemy. It is a problem for you. And I'll give you an example. When I was shooting a headshot, for example, big zoom lens shooting headshots, I would shoot typically at 4.0. Because if I went any more shallow than 4.0, if I went under 4.0, I would be in danger. If the subject turned their head, then this eye might be in focus and this eye might not be in focus. Because if you went to, say, 2.8 with a full frame and you're zoomed in with a big lens, that was going to be a problem for you. Your depth of field was going to be tiny, right? So I never did. I always shot it just at 4.0. However, now that I have a crop sensor camera, 4.0, I can shoot at 2.8 now and get the same as 4.0. So whereas you can easily say you have to shoot at 2.8 to get the same depth of field that I get at 4.0, I can say you have to shoot at 4.0 to get the same depth of field that I get at 2.8. Because while you can get a more shallow depth of field than I can at 4.0, I can get twice as much light in the camera as you can for the same depth of field. So many times when I was working on events, say I'm working a bar mitzvah or a wedding, I'm in a dark room and I'm shooting. When I think about my main concern when it comes to depth of field over the course of my career, the number of times that I was worried that I was too shallow, the number of times that I was worried I can't shoot this wide open, I'm going to have a focus problem when I get these images at home. This might be a problem. I can't shoot this wide. The number of times that that was a concern for me far outstripped the number of times that I was thinking I'm not shallow enough. Because if you're not shallow enough, you still have the image. You still have the shot. It's just one stop less shallow. But you still have the shot, right? Maybe the background's not quite as blurry as you want it to be. But you still have the shot. But if you make the mistake in the other direction and you're too shallow, now you don't have a shot. Hey, background looks great. Unfortunately, my subject's out of focus. It's two people, and one of them's in focus and one of them's not. So when you think about what my biggest concern is almost always that I'm too shallow, not that I'm not shallow enough. So when you are comparing these two sensors and looking at the depth of field, it can just as easily be seen as a plus that a crop sensor camera prevents you from having images that are out of focus more often than a full frame sensor. Right? It's all in how you look at it and all in how you shoot and what's important to you. Full frame performs better in low light than APS-C. Absolutely. I can't deny it. Except I can. Once again, full frame. If you are shooting with your full frame camera and our settings are exactly the same, we're both at the same aperture, the same ISO, the same shutter speed, you will perform better at low light than I will. Meaning that when we look at these images later in Photoshop, I will probably have more noise and more grain in my photograph than you will. And I've made videos about almost everything I'm talking about today, and I'll put them right up here for you. You should check them out. So yes, everything being exactly the same, you're going to perform better at low light than I am. However, everything is not going to be exactly the same because the settings on our cameras will be the same. You'll be at 4.0, I'll be at 4.0. You'll be at 100, I'll be at 100. You'll be at shutter speed 100, I'll be at shutter speed 100. Exactly the same, but the pictures are not going to look the same. Because even though the cameras are set up the same and the exposures will be the same, as I just talked about in the previous segment, the depth of field will not be the same. Right? So I am going to have to open up the aperture on my camera another stop to get my picture to look like yours. And when I do that, I'm going to have to make an adjustment. I'm going to have to either change my shutter speed or my ISO to match. Now, if you are in a low light situation, and you're shooting at 1600 ISO in a low light situation with your full frame camera, and you're at 4.0, I can shoot at 2.8, get the same depth of field that you're getting at 4.0, but I'm getting twice as much light in my camera. So now I can go to my ISO and change it to 800. You see, it's a seesaw. It's a teeter-totter, as we used to say. Because I can let more light in with my aperture, I can take light away with my ISO. So to get the same picture that you get at 4.0 1600, I can shoot at 2.8 800. Now do your comparison. Now look at the grain that you're getting at 1600 ISO and compare it to the grain that I'm getting at 800 ISO. And depending on what cameras you're using and what sensors you're using, because there's so many different variables, you're going to find that it's not necessarily as big a deal as you thought it was. See, that's the thing that people don't take into account when it comes to shooting in low light with APS-C and full frame, is that they just think all the settings on the camera have to be the same, when in reality that's not going to produce the same picture. What you have to look at is, what does the APS-C camera have to do to get the same picture with the same depth of field that the full frame is getting? And when you look at that, you have to change the settings. And when you change the settings, it means I can shoot at an ISO that is one stop lower than you can, which reduces my grain. Right? So when you look at it in that respect, yes, full frame at the same exact settings on the camera will look better. But does it look better than my camera when it is one ISO higher than my camera? Well, it might. It depends on what camera you're talking about. You may still win in that fight. Really, nobody wins. It's just a comparison. One may be better than the other. And the full frame may come out on top, but it may not. Or it may come out only a little tiny bit. So far, it seems like I'm beating up on full frame, and I'm trying to make a case for why APS-C is better than full frame and you should get APS-C. I'm really not. What I'm trying to do is show that it's just a question of conditions. It's a question of what works best for you, right? You can look at it from two angles. And part of the problem we've always had is that we tend to look at full frame as being better to begin with, and we accept the limitations of full frame. We don't think of them as limitations. We think of them as the standard. So here's one of the areas where we do that, and that is price. This is a situation where you actually are probably looking at it the wrong way. You can look at it in the opposite direction. If someone talks about price, well, hands down, APS-C is cheaper. Buying a crop sensor and crop sensor lenses is cheaper than buying full frame. Sure it is. But wait a minute. You're figuring that based on the idea that the full frame camera has to buy the same gear as the APS-C, and it doesn't. Because earlier when I said, I can shoot at 2.8 and get twice as much light in my camera for the same depth of field as you can get at 4.0, right? Win for me. The other way of looking at it is, Bure, you have to have a lens that shoots at 2.8 in order to get what I can get at 4.0, which is almost always cheaper. So, when you talk about price, if you're going to compare apples and apples, if you're going to say, I'm going to have a 2.8 lens and you're going to have a 2.8 lens, I'm going to win. But the bottom line is, you don't need a 2.8 lens. If you're just talking about depth of field, you don't need a 2.8 lens. Right? If you almost never shoot below 4 with your full frame, then if you love 4, then you can buy 4.0 lenses, and they are much cheaper than 2.8 lenses. You don't have to buy the Canon R5. You can buy the Canon R6 and a 4.0 lens. Now, compare that to the price of a Fuji X-T4 and a 2.8 lens. Now your prices are going to get a little bit closer. They might even overlap. The full frame might actually be cheaper. I don't know. I haven't run these numbers. And again, because the numbers will change tomorrow when they release a new camera, I'm not going to do that in this video. I'm going to make you do that, when you're ready to buy a camera. But the bottom line is, to get what you can get, have to buy the best camera and the best lens. You don't have to buy the best camera and the best lens to get what I get. And so therefore, you can bring your price down. So the idea that APS-C is always cheaper than full frame, well, yeah. But if you're shooting to get the same shot, not always. If you want to buy a full frame that will get as much light in the camera as my APS-C at 2.8, then you've got to buy 2.8 lenses. But if that's not important to you, then 4.0 lenses will do fine for you. And the reverse is true for me. If I want to buy a camera that gets as much light in the camera as you get, then I can buy 4.0 lenses. But if I want the depth of field to be the same, I've got to buy 2.8. In conclusion, what I'm trying to say is that when you are going to compare a full frame and an APS-C sensor, it's like comparing two cars from two, I want to say, almost drastically different manufacturers. If you want to compare a Corolla to a Camry, right, that's something you can kind of do. And okay, sure, I can see how one has got more features than the other, and so you pay more money for those features, etc. But with full frame and crop sensor, it's almost a little bit like trying to say, well, I can't decide between buying a Jeep or a Camry. Well, the Jeep is great. Off-road and ice and snow, wonderful, right? Whereas the Camry, well, it's cheaper and it gets better gas mileage. Sure, it gets better gas mileage and it rides better. But the Jeep's got all these other features, off-road and safety and stuff, with the ice and the snow. Yeah, but I live in Florida. I don't have any ice and snow here. So while the Jeep has all these great features in it, I don't necessarily need those features, right? So the Camry might be the better car for me. And one of the other things that you should also look at, and this was a big influence on me when I decided to make the jump to Fuji, was, It's like, say you own a top-of-the-line BMW, a BMW, and it's tricked out, it's got all the bells and whistles in it, very expensive, BMW's got everything, right? You love that car. And then it's time for you to get a new car, and the new BMWs that have all the bells and whistles that yours have, they're really expensive. They're more expensive than they used to be, and you're just not so sure that you're really going to get everything out of that BMW that you're paying for. Because they're so expensive. And you're not so sure you need all those bells and whistles. So you start to look at, maybe I'll buy the stripped down BMW. I'll buy the BMW that doesn't have all the bells and whistles. I'll be the stock. Like the starter BMW, that's what I'll do. I'll buy the starter BMW. And then you go over and you look at the Camry. And if you compare the stock Camry to the stock BMW, well. But if you compare the top of the line Camry, the Camry that's got all the bells and whistles in it, right? It's got everything you want. It's got the leather seats. It's got the heated steering wheel. It's got the backup cameras and the side lane departure warning. It's got all that stuff versus the stock BMW. If you can get this car cheaper than this car, then that's a legitimate thing to look at. Because while BMW may be a better car than Camry, right? Maybe, I don't know. You have to look at the features and what you want. And for me, as much as I love BMWs, at my age, I like the luxury features more than I like, I don't know, that it's faster or it jumps off, or whatever, or it handles tighter. Those are things that are great in a BMW. But what I'd really rather have than that is a car that's super, super comfortable to me. So maybe buying, I don't know, a Buick, I don't know, anything, but getting all the luxury bells and whistles and stuff like that. Maybe that's better for me now than buying the stock sports car or the stock BMW. Only you can decide. Only you can decide what works best for you. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that medium format is better than APS-C, because it's not better, it's just different. Medium format, you can get a more shallow depth of field than I can get. Yes, I can get more light into the camera than you can at the same depth of field. These are two legitimate things. Look at them both. Figure out which one is better for you. APS-C is cheaper than full frame. Yes, unless you're buying full frame that's not top of the line and you're buying 4.0 lenses instead of 2.8 lenses, then maybe not so much. Do you really need top of the line? Do you really need 2.8 lenses? Look at these things. Figure out which one works best for you and make your decision. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that just because it's full frame, it must be better than APS-C, or that APS-C must be cheaper than full frame. Give me a like. Give me a comment. Oh, please, give me all the comments. Come at me. Come on, bring them. And be sure and subscribe to my channel. And thanks for watching.